Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 33rd chapter in the book of Job. We took it all the way up till the 18th verse. We're going to take it from 19 all the way home to 33. And before that, we just want to review Elihu. Is a hitherto unknown name before the 32nd chapter. He was a young observer who, when the elders around him were the sustained stalemate had finally reached a breaking point in the night between Job and his antagonist, with his ninth and final speech that spans the range of 6 chapters. But then we hear an equal amount of chapters from a young man who was an observer. We can imagine that there were people watching this debate going on. You know who else was watching? Yahweh. And it's interesting because he doesn't reprove Elihu, but he does reprove Job's 3 comforters, misleadingly named. And but Elihu, he does offer some perspective and a lot of wisdom. He doesn't have a dog in the fight. He's not personally invested. He makes it known. Now, in the 32nd chapter, we read that he addresses Job's 3 comforters, and his argument with them is they failed to answer him. They kept saying that there was sin, but they did not prove it. And so that was tantamount to declaring Elohim wicked in his. So that's his motivation for speaking to him. But then he turns the tide. He speaks to Job from 33 through 37, so most of his material is directed at Job, who he turns to, and he makes known in the previous chapter that Job never insulted him. He was not party or participant in the exchange of insults that passed back and forth between them in the chapters we've uncovered. It got increasingly acrimonious with each round, and then the personal innuendo, and then Job finally gives a long wind of speech, but this man is also full of wind, as he makes known. He has a lot of pent-up rage and a pent-up just this compulsion to speak, but he is deferential. He allows his elders to speak first. This is a principle we do well to observe, even when we have valid input and perspective on things. We should always, as a general principle, allow our elders the due deference of speaking the most. But he turns the try to Job, second verse, 33rd chapter. My words are from the uprightness of my hearts. My lips shall speak knowledge clearly. So he claims ironclad integrity, uprightness of heart. This is something Job also claimed. So that's the nature of the stalemate. Job, between him and his 3 comforters, he insisted on the integrity of his innocence, and his friends all insisted that he had some secret hidden. But Elihu doesn't have no ulterior agenda. He's in defense of God, and he doesn't have a personal dog in their fight. So his nature against Job was somewhat similar to the nature of his beef with Job was somewhat similar. He had declared himself right rather than Elohim, so he had done so. He had declared himself innocent at the expense of Elohim, and this man's the 3 friends' failure to answer him adequately was at the expense of Elohim. So he's speaking on his behalf, and he has confidence that he's not only wise but able to communicate it effectively. So he's saying, pay attention. This is the 3rd verse. I already said 2, but verse 6. See, I am like you before El. I too have been formed out of clay. He doesn't talk down to Job. He looks him in the eye and say, I'm the same as you. We are equals. I am not better than you. You are not better than me. This is something Job's 3 friends did. They were better off than Job. So according to their stubbornly simplistic, archaic theological prism, black and white prism of just misfortune being rooted in unrighteousness, cause them to flaunt themselves at his expense. But Elihu's approaching him from honest eye to eye. He's the same as him. He's not claiming to be he democratizes Job to himself. And the nature of his complaint is some of the things that Job said. He gets he gets one significant thing wrong. He says that I have no wickedness. Job did not claim sinlessness. In fact, he did so explicitly in the opposite lens in the 9th chapter. But that's something that he heard. He was probably he paid attention. The meticulousness of his attentiveness to detail is made plain in the previous chapter. But, he also says he counts me as his enemy. That is something that Job said. So Job declared that he was just, and because all this injustice was inflicted upon him in spite of his justice, that meant God was unjust. And he couldn't for the life of him figure out why he was being treated as an enemy by someone he knew as a friend and walked with until recently. Verse 12, see in this you have not been righteous. Let me answer you. Eloha is greater than man. So his greatness, his supremacy, his superiority, his transcendence above and beyond us does not mean that he is obligated to explain himself to any of us. So we cannot protest that he is unjust just because the world and all the weight of the world is crushing us in the twinkle of an eye, as it was in Job's case. So he was, the sin of self-righteousness, there was some accuracy in this observation of his. So Job, even though he did not suffer because he sinned, as his three comforters insisted, but he sinned in his suffering on a few occasions. Most recently, he talks about approaching him like a prince in the 37th chapter of his 37th verse of the 31st chapter. For El speaks once or twice, one does not notice. God is speaking. The problem is that man is not listening. The problem is that people have ears of sound, but not ears of faith. So there is, we have ears that can detect physical sounds and vibrations and all the rest, but we also have spiritual ears, which are open to the perception that engage the divine. So he does speak to us, and we have to speak to him in prayer if we want him to speak to us. You cannot turn on his voice like a faucet, and I've never personally heard a tangible voice, but he does speak to me in ways. I'll just give you one example. Early in the coronavirus pandemic, which we are currently underway with at the filming of this, I was suffering from racing thoughts, just being the isolation and inactivity of being bound in my home all the time. But I received a revelation from him that I was to pray my prayers out loud as opposed to merely thinking them. And that's been something I've been doing ever since. And it has slowed down the accelerated and tests. And I've also adjusted but the point is that I have an awareness of what he's saying to me. I know myself well enough to know that I could never think of that myself. Ergo, it had to come from him. He's the one who planted that thought there. But he also, into Elihu's pointed passage, he speaks of in a dream, visions. These are two customary revelatory communication in the Old Testament. But he speaks of him rudely interrupting the sleep and rest of a sinner, the sadistic sinner who literally can't get to sleep at night unless he plots evil and knows what he's doing the next day. He can interrupt them and intervene and warn them through something unpleasant that it's not going to end well for them. And this can stimulate a repentance of him. He keeps back his soul from the pit in his life, from passing away by the sword. So this is what is ultimately, the salvation is being, he's attributing salvation to Elohim. That's what he means by being restrained and kept away from the pit of hell. So this life, even though it ends, it does not, death is the beginning, not the end. We have immortal elements. So Elihu, there is a lot of wisdom in this young man, and he does speak, to his credit, with more class and dignity and integrity than Job's three misleadingly named comforters. 19th verse, 33rd chapter lesson itself. And he is reproved with pain on his bed, and with unceasing distress in his bones. This is an unusual, this definitely constitutes what is known as an original thought. He's speaking of suffering as a form of revelation. God speaks to us in our pains to bring us to him. And when we have the mindset of the Christian rather than that of the world, we enter into the fellowship of suffering, and we find comfort and relief in the Father of all comforters. 2 Corinthians, first chapter. But, pain, it is the existence of pain and suffering that has taught me everything I know about myself, this life that I have, and my God. and prosperity and pleasure has not taught me a lick or iota. So he does have the correct counterintuitive mindset to make the most of pain, and that is one of what God's ways of speaking to you. Now, he does not speak in a voice, and he speaks through other people, but our spiritual receptors, our ears of faith, will detect and know and discern when God is speaking to us through other people. But the unceasing distress, this is, he's talking about physical symptoms that are native to Job at this moment in time. Job was an emaciated man. He was not doing well emotionally. He was not doing well health-wise, physically, and he was not doing well spiritually. He just had this agony about his soul, and it was reflected in his decomposing physical frame, in his bones, which were popping out of his skin because he was so emaciated. And he, so that his life loathes bread, and his soul desirable food. So Job couldn't even eat if he wanted to, which he didn't. He did not desire to live. He was pleading for death and not willing to commit suicide. But he was fasting this entire time. He sat there in a sackcloth for 7 days. So this was, and they didn't even move. They just sat in stunned silence, and then this debate breaks off. So during that time, the fasting is a form of revelation, and he does speak to us because remember what I said about praying to hear the voice of divinity. Nothing will accelerate your prayer quite like fasting. This is when the necessity becomes urgent as the flesh groans under the strain and the intense agony of being deprived. That's what it needs to sustain. That which it is accustomed to consuming. But if you are fasting without praying, you're just starving yourself. You're not definitionally fasting. His flesh waste away, and his bones, which were not seen, stick out. So my bones are not visible. You have no way of telling, but I'm not a bony build person, and this is a sign of unhealth. This is to be super skinny, so much so that your bones poke through your flesh. This was an emaciated condition. This was abnormal. So prior to this point in moment in time, and until 7 days ago, we don't have any indication of how long this debate lasted, but Job is nevertheless, even if it was only 7 days, he is still exalted as an exemplar of endurance by James in 5:11. So he, there's literally nothing like his experience to lose everything, literally everything, in the twinkle of an eye for no other reason than Satan successfully goaded God into a debate over his righteous servant. So the real battle was between God and Satan, and the lot was riding on Job. But God knew Job well enough to know that he could go all the way without blaspheming him. And he does, he's praying intensely and fervently and frequently for an audience. And it's if you ask enough, if you want something bad enough, there is a qualitative element in prayer as well as a quantitative element. If you want something bad enough and you want him to speak to you, you have to keep praying for it. It's not a one-and-done finality, and you cannot turn the voice of God on like a faucet. It is not so simple, but he does speak to you once you develop the ears of ears of faith. And his soul draws near the pit, and his life to the destroyers. So the pit is just analogous to death, not necessarily hell in this concept. So Job's life, he considered himself just withering and decaying and ready to die. He was just praying that God would end it at one point. He cursed the day that he was born and wished it had never been. So all that Job had gone to just amounted to an indigestible elixir. But Job, he speaks of the Sheol, the place of the dead, the place of no return, but he also expresses hope of a resurrection, a bodily one, in the 19th verse. And, some biblical commentators interpret the 30th verse, we're not quite there yet, as a portent of the resurrection, or a witness thereto. And if there is an angel for him, a mediator, one among 1,000, to show man his straightness. A mediator was something that Job prayed and longed for. He wished there was someone to bridge the gap, to intercede on his behalf, with and he is not quite as Christological. The mediator that he imagines would have been an angelic one, because he is living before the Messiah, before Moses even. So Job is the earliest written account in the Old Testament, chronologically speaking. But just, one of 1,000. Now, there are 100 million angels in heaven, according to the 5th chapter of Revelation. But the thing about John is he was not taking a mathematically precise inventory. And the Hebrew approach to numbers is, objectively speaking, more superstitious than scientific. This is why I cannot endorse the theory of biblical inerrancy, because the numbers do not add up. But the Hebrews, they were more loose with their approach to numbers. The real significance of their numbers lies in the numerology. And so, but in any case, he's just asking for one, praying for one among 1,000, just to show a man his straightness, and how he answers that prayer, or what he expects, because this is the first half of a sentence. 24th verse completes the sentence, is that this angel would save him in spite of himself. We cannot declare ourselves innocent through a mediator. The mediator exists to take our guilt away, and that's what the Son did. Then he shows grace to him and says, "Release him from going down to the pit. I have found an atonement." An atonement is alternately translated as redeemer. This is another thing that Job longs for, but in the Hebrew original, it does have atoning connotations. This is distinct from a family redeemer, such as we read of in Ruth and the law of Moses, at least one of them, if not several. But he's also speaking, this is somewhat similar to the portend of the resurrection, but not, the release from going to the pit of hell, the pit of death, the pit of no return, the pit of outer darkness. That is a place that you don't want to go. But, thankfully we do have a mediator who paved the way and paid the price to reconcile and bridge us to our Heavenly Father, and our, as an attendant blessing, our heavenly homeland. Let his flesh become fresher than a child's. Let him return to the days of his youth. Now, connected to the resurrection, this can be interpreted as a bodily endorsement. The only sound scriptural argument that can be made in favor of a spiritual resurrection, one that denies the body, is Ecclesiastes 12:7 in my research. So there is a bodily resurrection. It's not a myth. It's not a metaphor. It is the most controversial yet central claim of our faith. It should be non-negotiable, but realistically and tragically, it's not. But he's speaking of a renewal and just a second chance. This is the life after the life, which is going to be longer than the life that we have on this earth. This is the life without end, and we will enter it as a child, and it'll be just a total newness, and we will not age in eternity as we do in this life. He prays to Eloah, and he accepts him, and he sees his face with joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. Restores to man his righteousness. That is something that we are constitutionally incapable of doing, because we have no righteousness to, strictly speaking, call our own. Our best works on our best days are likened to filthy rags before him who's without blemish, Isaiah 64:6. So for any man to, before the sacred presence, the stain of sin, even a single sin, cannot be omitted and cannot be allowed. So the way that we are restored to righteousness is by the imputation. The Son became and is our vicarious atonement. So he fulfills the vacancy that he references in the 24th verse. We're on the 26th. So he prays to Eloah, and he accepts him, and he sees his face with joy. And so to pray to Eloah, if you want to be accepted, you have to be approved. And in order to be approved, you have to prove yourself. You have to refine yourself in the furnace, much as metal, in the same sense that metal is proved through the furnace, so too must the Christian go through the furnace of affliction. And just to see his face with joy, he is invisible this side of the veil, but we might be able to see him, gaze upon him with our eyes of faith that are, if not exactly visual in the physical sense, as real as I am looking to you in mine. Now, that would be, imagine there was no camera between us, just face to face. That is what we're going to be able to see of his face, and it will be a joyous sight to behold. We will be rejoicing, we'll be dancing, we'll be worshiping. Because the angels and the 24 in Revelation, they literally cannot resist the urge to be engaged in perpetual prayer just by their proximity of exposure to the divine majesty. He sings to men and says, I have sinned and I have perverted what was right, and it did not profit me. Sin does not, the wages of sin do not pay. It is an investment with poor dividends that will cost you your eternal life. Well, that's not completely true because you remain immortal in spite of yourself. But if you are wicked and unrepenting and unbelieving, then you're going to have no flesh, no bodily vessel in the afterlife. Your physical frame will descend to the pit of fire, and it does not end well. You will not spend an eternity burning in hell. What happens is your physical body is eviscerated, then your immortal soul lingers out in solitude, no one there to talk to, no one to comfort, just complete utter loneliness in the outer darkness. Your soul will be a slave to itself. He has redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and my life sees the light. This is the second thing that is similar to the 30th verse I already referenced. So this saving, redeeming one, that is someone who pays the price and assumes the consequence and the ownership. It is an act of ownership. So when he redeems us, we belong to him. He's the only one who can redeem our souls from going down to the pit. And through him, our life can see the light. Now, in the heavenly the New Jerusalem that awaits us, there's not going to be a sun or a moon because the Lamb in Yahweh will be the light. So radiant will their unveiled splendor be that there's not going to be any need for a sun or a moon. See, El does all these twice 3 times with the man. Twice 3, we read that once before, the 14th verse, once, twice. So this is, again, the Hebrew approach to numbers should not be interpreted too literally because, it's just a way of saying, they are more loose in their approach to the precision, the mathematical precision in their use of numbers. He's just saying, a few times, but more than once or twice, so 2 or 3, that's what that means. So he does reach out to us repeatedly and to redeem us and restore us, and he does give us a window to repent, because that is a testament to his goodness, Romans 2:4. To bring back his soul from the pit, to be enlightened with the light of the living. So we focused enough about hell, I feel, so far. Now, the second part of the verse, the bottom half, speaks of heaven. Enlightened with the light of the living, that means we're going to live in the light, be the light, bask in the light, just be surrounded in light. There's not going to be any need for a sun or a moon because light is good. Light is positive energy. It is the presence of something. So there is no such thing as darkness. There is only absence of light. And light is good, but there is such a thing as too much light because our physical eyes cannot behold but a tiny infinitesimal fraction of the total range of spectrums that there is to see. And our sight is advanced amongst the animals. Other animals, their sense of smell is mostly how they get around, but they can smell things, and food must even taste better to a dog. Why do they love food so much? Because they can smell. So the light of the living, he's speaking of heaven in simple terms, because that is where we're going to live, and we will live after death in eternity and in his presence. But someone has to pay the price. Someone has to mediate for us. Someone has to atone for us. Someone has to redeem us Thankfully, that was done, one and done finality by the one that Job could only reach out to in faith. So he is a pre-Christian Christian. Pay attention, Job. Listen to me. Keep silent and let me speak. So this is somewhat unusual or uncharacteristic for him to, even try to establish his dominance or claim any form of superior, just to tell him to shut up and listen. That is what he's saying, albeit in gentler words. But that is essentially what he's saying. He's doing it artfully. He's doing it diplomatically. But the reason that he gives in the next verse is inconsistent with something that he does not say, but we read. The author of Job says this, that the reason that he burned against Job, and he was actually angry with the three friends. So there's about 4 times when he says that he is angry or alludes to his anger. But he is, the nature of his complaint and the nature of his protest and the nature of the fury that is motivating the anger that he has towards Job is that he declared himself, he justified himself, but he did so at the expense of Elohim, which amounts to no justification at all. To bring back his, if there are any words, answer me, speak, for I desire to declare you right. Declare you right, that's alternately translated as justification. That's not exactly how it reads. That's how we translate it. Because, this translation is, in a lot of ways, not our favorite, but we still feel it's the best one. But this is inconsistent with what the detail that the author provides, because the author of Job, he wrote the 28th chapter, and he also writes this detail. We don't hear Elihu speak until the 6th verse, but the author does provide some details concerning what motivates or prompts him speaking. There's just this sustained silence, and his wrath is building up in him, and he is pent up with words, but he waits for his elders to speak first. But, the nature, his hidden thoughts, what we know that Job doesn't know, so he's doing it. He's artfully dodging the fact that the reason he was criticizing him is because he justified himself at the expense of Elohim. If not, listen to me, keep silent, and let me teach you wisdom. This is a big mouth from a youngin', but he shoots the way he shouts, and his words do pack a punch, teach you, so this is a lot more meaningful from him, because he was not a brash young man. He was actually wise beyond his years, but, Job was the wisest one of the bunch. So none of them knew what he was going through, and also not even Job knew what transpired in the first 2 chapters. We are indebted to the author of Job for the details therein. So Job, the book of Job, belongs in the category of wisdom literature. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is the intelligent use of intelligence. It is the sum composite of prudence, discretion, intelligence, knowledge, understanding, all the synonyms we read in the book of Proverbs, which is one of the other books that belongs in that categories. And there is a lot, and the wisdom literature also prompts the difficult and uneasy questions to which there are no easy answers to. Now, without these questions, faith would not be necessary. The nature of the book, the question prompting the book of Ecclesiastes is, what is the meaning of life? And Job belongs in a theodicy which attempts to explore or explain the relationship of the righteousness and suffering. So why do bad things happen to good people? And conversely, why do good things happen to bad people? If there's this all just, all loving, all-powerful God in the sky, why does he not intervene? Why does he allow us human agency? So there are no easy answers to these questions, and there are several questions within within those broad questions, but that is the framework of questions, the nature of which is the wisdom of which the book of Job is oriented toward. So they're all struggling to make sense of incomprehensible forces. They have perceptions, but they all fall short. None of them knew what the reader knows took place. This is all a bet, basically. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.